Turkish Cypriots is probably the best ethnic group to have a conflict with. If you have to choose between Israelis, Palestinians, Tamils, Houthis, Hutu, Tutsis, you're probably going to choose the Turkish Cypriots and the other way around. So we have a very close relationship between the Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities. And also, we don't gain anything as Greek Cypriots by isolating the Turkish Cypriots. We have, if we want to be more assertive towards the other side, there are better ways to do that. We can try to sanction Turkey in other ways, which affect its more core strategic interests on the defense sector. But the best guarantee that an agreement will be implemented is that it's profitable on both sides. There's something very sad in international politics. We ended up losing trust to each other. So the Security Council is in a turmoil. The good era of peacemaking in the 1990s is gone. International business adjusted very well in this because we cannot trust each other. They created arbitration law. And arbitration law boomed, exploded as one of the key industries. Not having those mechanisms is like giving your 18-year-old child a car without an insurance. Would you risk that?
Welcome to the second episode of Bolidis To The Point podcast. With me today is Professor Neophytos Loizidis, Professor of International Conflict Analysis from the University of Warwick, who specializes in areas such as power sharing, in displacement, in the peaceful return of victims of ethnic cleansing, who's advised governments and international organizations. You work currently at the University of Warwick. You previously worked at the University of Princeton, Queen's, University of Belfast, and University of Kent, among others. Thank you very much for being here today with us.
Thank you.
Let's get straight to the chase. Conflict. You have some quite considerable experience with Northern Ireland, having been based there as well. What were the main lessons that you took from that conflict and its resolution?
I was privileged to get my first permanent appointment at Queen's University Belfast in 2005. That was 7 years after the Good Friday Agreement. So I was probably the only Cypriot who experienced a resolution of a conflict. It was as if I was living in a united Cyprus 7 years after. I could experience what was happening with power sharing, with negotiations between nationalist and unionist in the province, relationships with the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom. It was very common for myself to organize conferences almost in a monthly basis. So a lot of our colleagues in Cyprus had the opportunity to visit Northern Ireland and also have themselves this first-hand experience. There were particularly major questions of how we can bring together outside external forces to support a settlement. That was number one. How political parties engage with the process. How do we negotiate and win referendums, as well as how we can do power sharing. So these were the four major areas I worked while I was in Northern Ireland.
From those areas, which do you think translate to something of value for the Eastern Mediterranean and specifically for Cyprus?
The most interesting innovation in Northern Ireland is what we call power sharing. In fact, we call it liberal power sharing, where each of the groups in the province can form a political party. They can be mixed unionist and nationalist. It can be only nationalists. We don't discriminate. And on the basis of their electoral performance, they are also automatically represented in the parliament. But the most interesting innovation in Northern Ireland is that they're automatically entitled seats in the cabinet.
Right.
So there are no negotiations, no deadlocks. They can all be part of the power sharing system. This is a proposal that Polidis covered for Cyprus maybe 15 years ago, and it was very welcome at the time. It was discussed in the negotiations because the person who leads from the UN side is from Northern Ireland, so he knows the system. We admire it as political scientists. John McGarry has been involved. We co-author papers together. So the proposal is in the agenda to having something of this type. And I also recently suggested it in a forthcoming publication with International Affairs to Syria. So it's not only for Cyprus, we're discussing in a lot of different places as a potential model for the Eastern Mediterranean as well.
So this is the D'Hondt system of governance, which gives every party a seat in the cabinet based on the number of seats it won in the parliament.
Precisely, they're using the D'Hondt method for the allocation of the seats in the cabinet. It's democratic, it's inclusive, it's proportional. There is no need for deadlocks and negotiations in the process. Everybody is included in the process. You guarantee that you're going to have Turkish Cypriot moderates and Greek Cypriot moderates in the cabinet. It has many advantages, and it got the attention of the Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot negotiators. So I wouldn't be surprised at my return to it sometime in the future.
One of the interesting things I found about the Northern Ireland peace processes was the inclusion of all the relevant actors in the negotiations. So you had British negotiators, Republic of Ireland negotiators, you had the Republicans and loyalists present, and it seemed to me to allow them all to talk on different tables. So there was a table dealing with power sharing within Northern Ireland, which is our version of the intercommunal federal government. You had another table where they were dealing with the relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. It's two separate areas, the north and south of the island of Ireland. And then you had the regional relationship. And each table, which they called pillars, did not affect the other. So the negotiations were allowed to proceed without waiting for progress on one table or another. They were occurring independently. I don't see that in the Cyprus peace process. We have never had that. The closest thing we came was in Crans-Montana. There were two tables, one dealing with, let's say, the intercommunal issues, and one dealing with the issues of the guarantor powers and security. But they were definitely linked together in terms of how one could progress with the other.
Precisely, there was a much more carefully designed peace process there. There was elections, and the parties that got more than 10% could be included in the negotiating table. So that gave the inclusivity element. Before that, there were two political parties on the nationalist side. One was associated with IRA, Sinn Féin, and the other one STLP. The leaders of STLP insisted that Sinn Féin itself should be included. So they didn't want to leave Sinn Féin out. And for that, they held secret negotiations in a monastery. I used to do tours of Northern Ireland to my guests, and I used to take them to Clodagh Monastery, where one of the religious figures there brought together the two groups within the Catholic community to negotiate a joint front. That was the idea. So the principle of inclusivity was always in the process, and it was translated into this 10% participation threshold, which included also the Women's Coalition Party.
So, if I understand correctly, what you had there was a party, Sinn Féin, with the political front of the paramilitary organization, the IRA, which up until that point had very clear position in favor of one Ireland, joining a peace process that was actually going to create an intercommunal government within Britain, within the United Kingdom of Britain and Northern Ireland, which is a big turn in a sense. And at the same time, you had loyalists who were also involved in the negotiations, who accepted ultimately in the final agreement that the people of Ireland on both sides, north and south, would ultimately decide the future of the island, which included a possibility of one day not being part of the UK. So everyone, in a sense, moved away from their core goals to reach that agreement. And how did they do that?
Both sides had to gain something from the agreement. Until then, they wouldn't share power. So decisions would have been made from London with some input from Dublin. by entering into a power sharing arrangement, they could now govern their own province. They were incentivized by the British state and created this very large Northern Irish Assembly, more than 100 representatives, which is quite large for the size of Northern Ireland. It's almost like Cyprus, right? And the idea there was that even the smallest loyalist parties would be represented in the political process. They were also granted forms of indirect or direct amnesties and early prisoners release. So people who were in prisons on both sides could now be allowed to return back to civilian life, even elected in political offices. And there was also the belief that, and that was what I experienced, that after the end of violence, Northern Ireland would flourish, become a much richer part of the United Kingdom, which is what I experienced by being there. The life was very pleasant. It was a very enjoyable experience, living in a place where you had all the energy of people who have suffered all their lives with division, with hatred. Now they could spend they could now have a proper life. It was a very pleasant and rewarding experience to be in a post-conflict environment.
So let's talk a bit about sequence, because in order to get to that point from a high street that had British soldiers outside every shop screening the shoppers who went in, to a situation where people were invited to the most bombed hotel in Europe to have conferences about peace. Mm-hmm. But to get to that point, not all of the issues were resolved with the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement of 1998. This was a 37 page document. It did not resolve all the issues. If I remember well, maybe disarmament, prisoner release possibly, fundamental freedoms. There were issues that were left for later. The issues that were going to be deal breakers were not resolved. Is that true? And how do you get people to agree to a peace deal that doesn't include the most sensitive issues?
Yeah, they call it in Northern Ireland the principle of constructive ambiguity. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, leaving things out. But you essentially, in any peace negotiation, you have two options. Negotiate everything and spend a lot of time. And this is the option in Cyprus. If we have to negotiate everything, it's going to be a very lengthy process. Or leaving some of the issues for the future and having the mechanisms to resolve them. Now, in Northern Ireland, peace process was not perfect because we didn't have the mechanisms to solve some of the forthcoming issues there. But in the case of Cyprus, because of some of the sensitivities that involve on both sides, what will be a very important lesson is not to try to address everything from the beginning, but to have a mechanism that we both sides feel comfortable that would allow us to address any possible ambiguities or deadlocks. We don't want to have ambiguities that will bring the agreement down. We might leave some gaps for later on, but it's essential to have the mechanism, the last resort mechanism. We cannot agree to deal with some of these issues. Where do we go? And that's what we need.
Okay, that's an interesting input into the next question, which is on Cyprus. So, based on your own experience living in Belfast and also your studies across the world, how do you see or define the Cyprus peace process? I've heard you call it in the past an archaic process. Could you elaborate? What do you mean by that?
It's archaic because we only have the two leaders negotiating. So that's a format that we're not very comfortable with. Ideally, peace agreements need to be more inclusive. They need to have more input from political parties, from civil society, citizen assemblies, direct participation in voting, in referendums. So that's what we expect from a negotiated agreement. So the two-leader format is something that is not working perfectly well in Cyprus. At the same time, we have done a lot of progress. We have been very close to the peace settlement several times in the past, and most Greek and Turkish Cypriots will agree with that. I often start any of my introductions to the Cyprus problem by saying that Turkish Cyprus is probably the the best ethnic group to have a conflict with. If you have to choose between Israelis, Palestinians, Tamils, Houthis, Hutu, Tutsis, you're probably going to choose the Turkish Cypriots and the other way around. So we have a very close relationship between the Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities. It is a bicommunal conflict to some extent, because there is an international dimension and Turkish dimension. But when it comes to the two communities, we have done enormous progress bringing the two sides together. So we're very much into a situation that we can move to a comprehensive peace settlement. The relationships in Northern Ireland used to be much tougher. Even 10 years after I was there, sometimes it was very scary to go between one neighborhood to another. You feel much more comfortable going now in the other side of Nicosia, a few blocks from here, than walking through Belfast at that time. I remember I had a guest from Rwanda and they were very scared walking through Belfast. So in a way, I think we're facing a conflict in Cyprus which is highly resolvable and which can, with efforts from a lot of different actors, we can bring it to an end.
Okay, let's talk a little. Let's explore that view. How we can bring it to an end. Now, you've advised governments in the past. Do you feel that governments in a conflict situation like this might possibly fear losing control by changing certain processes? For example, you spoke about the possibility of not resolving everything at once, leaving some things for later. This moves away from the Big Bang principle that you have a solution and the next day everything is in play. To do that, you have to remove or alter the negotiating principle that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Mm-hmm. So what you're proposing, is this something that could be received well, or is there a fear of losing control of the process?
There is a fear of not giving away your trump cards, right? The Turkish Cypriots for many years knew that they have to return Varosha, but they don't want to give it because they think that if Greek Cypriots get Varosha, they wouldn't be talking to us anymore. They would get there what they want, and they would turn their back to us. They already do. Same with the Greek Cypriots. They will argue that if we provide some sort of allowance to the Turkish Cypriot authorities to have direct flights or direct trade, and we're going to enter a period of Taiwanization where they will be getting everything, and we're not going to be able to influence them in the future. And for many years we have done a lot of talking to stakeholders on both sides that this is not the case.
Could you elaborate?
Yeah, exactly. So when it comes to issues like that, they can be negotiated separately as part of an incremental approach to the Cyprus issue in order to build confidence. That's a rationale we had for many years. A few years back, I had a lunch with a senior diplomat in Ankara who was leading the Cyprus desk, and his reply on Varosha was that it's not going to be a confidence-building measure, it's going to be a confidence-destroyer measure. This is a core belief. And in a way, he was probably right, because he brought the example, we were opening Lydras right here at the time, and we had a dispute where the flowers would go. And it was a little bit of a crisis over that, if I remember correctly. So they were bringing that every time we do a confidence-building measure, we get into trouble. However, what we've been arguing recently is that we can use them as backstops, meaning that we can enter a comprehensive negotiation and we can have on both sides, the Greek Cypriot side and the Turkish Cypriot side, some early wins. So regardless of the outcome of the process, either side will gain, or both sides will gain something at the end of the process. So there's no point in having negotiations that will lead to stalemate and back to the status quo. We should enter negotiations with the guarantee that we're going to gain something at the very end. And the backstop could be, for example, Varosha for the Greek Cypriots and some sort of international links for the Turkish Cypriots. So they have been asking for many years, and both opposition and Tatar, and both Erhuman and Tatar were pushing for that. Now, how are we going to decide those backstops? We can decide them. The final arrangements could be decided on the basis of how much goodwill you show in the overall negotiations. And in this way, we can guarantee both the wins, and we can also guarantee that sides will remain committed to the peace process. So we don't lose any of the points that those who oppose these arrangements make in the negotiations. It's going to be definitely confidence building. There's going to be no confidence destroyer.
Okay, let's flesh that out. You said early wins. Does that mean these wins would take place during negotiations or only if negotiations fail?
It could be done 6 months after the start of the negotiations. So the moment you sign up to the negotiations, you know that in 6 months, if you are the Greek Cypriot negotiator, you can have Varosha, regardless of the outcome. But the conditions that you get Varosha would depend on your overall comprehensive attitudes in the negotiations. That's the idea.
So if you're not considered to be constructive in the peace process in those first 6 months, does that mean you don't get Varosha?
You might get Varosha, but you might get it in a way that is not fully compatible with your preferences. And the Turkish Cypriots will get the airport situation, the recognition of the universities and other issues closer to their own preferences. So the final arrangements will be decided on the basis of what is perceived as the goodwill of the two sides. We want to lock both sides into a goodwill mood in the negotiations. And we want to test from the very beginning their determination to go for a comprehensive settlement, while making progress also on Varosha and other issues.
And would these backstops include other relevant actors like Turkey, for example?
Precisely, these are binding agreements. So any party that doesn't meet its commitments, we have consequences at the very end. These are international, high-profile agreements that have impact on key issues of interest for Turkey.
So if one of the relevant actors, like Turkey, for example, is considered to be not constructive in the peace process in the first 6 months, they might perhaps be obliged to open their ports to Cypriot flagships and airplanes, something like that.
We can discuss those. I'm giving an example here.
Yeah.
I don't want to, probably might not be wise to go into more details of how these backstops, we're keeping some of the best ideas for the negotiators themselves, but there could be different types of backstops. The idea there is one should not focus on the specific backstops, but focus on the logic. And the logic is that we want to make progress on key issues on the ground without undermining the comprehensive peace settlement, the prospect for a comprehensive peace settlement. We want to get both. The argument so far against Varosha and against the incremental approach is that it's going to block the comprehensive one.
Because it's too complicated, because they'll get bogged down in details.
Yeah. And that's why 50 years on, we have an empty city, which from the point of view of Turkey, they need to pay a rent every month. The moment that we finish this interview, there is a bill that Turkey needs to pay to the Greek Cypriot inhabitants. And also, we don't gain anything as Greek Cypriots by isolating the Turkish Cypriots. We have, if we want to be more assertive towards the other side, there are better ways to do that. We can try to sanction Turkey in other ways, which affect its more core strategic interests on the defense sector. But with the Turkish Cypriots, especially when you have a victory by moderate sides on the Turkish Cypriot community, isolation doesn't serve them and doesn't serve us. On the contrary, we want cooperation to be the key principle. But I understand that both sides, Greek and Turkish Cypriots, have some fears that the incremental approach will block any progress on the comprehensive settlement. That's why I linked the issues, the overall behavior with the comprehensive peace settlement to what is happening what will eventually happen in the development of the backstops.
Okay, I think the question that comes up a lot when you talk about backstops is who decides and how?
Right.
What are the criteria?
Yeah, so the beauty of that is that you can decide the criteria as Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. We can control the process right now. So we need to decide three things. What are the criteria? What is the key backstops? We don't want to have a backstop that threatens either side's vital interest, issues of recognition, and we need to decide in advance that this is going to be a binding process. So whatever is decided at the very end has to be executed by both sides and accepted. So you don't get to choose. It's a final. It has a finality. And we need to decide who will make this decision, who might not be the United Nations, might be an external, high-profile international diplomat or a group of 3 international diplomats, including maybe a Greek Cypriot and a Turkish Cypriot who advises them.
So one of the things I've heard when I've discussed issues like backstops, because we've had a conversation about this in the past as well, is whoever this neutral person or committee will be, they will always be open to influence from much more powerful actors. Which is another way of saying that a Greek Cypriot fear is that a neutral body will be vulnerable to influence from a much bigger regional player called Turkey.
We can choose someone who has a good reputation for their honesty. They are honest people in the planet and diplomats with high levels of integrity and reputation that will not be influenced by one way or another. And they're of course accountable themselves. We set up the criteria, we specify the issues. And fundamentally, either way we gain. So it's not about either Varosha or airports. Both sides will win. But it's the preferences, the specific way that this is going to be introduced, that will be affected by the final tribunal who make the decision. So we limit the risks for the two sides in terms of the process. But we don't want to turn this into an endless negotiation.
Okay. I think the other thing that we have to accept is that there is a lot of, despite the many decades of trust-building efforts, there's a lot of mistrust and distrust of either side. Mm-hmm. From a Greek Cypriot perspective, I hear a lot even if we reach an agreement, how do we know Turkey will give Varosha in those 6 months when direct trade or direct flights, I think you mentioned, are activated as part of the backstop?
Yeah, it would be a high-profile negotiation. It would be a negotiation that a lot of countries will get credit. Backstop is a British export. People in the British political establishment, they like backstops. They talk about backstops in Ukraine now after solving the Northern Irish agreement. We can involve foreign governments. There's a lot of interest in Japan in terms of getting into the peace process in Cyprus and other actors. Donald Trump wants to take the credit for an arrangement like that. It's not easy to leave an agreement of that type and not implement it. There will be major costs in Turkey, and Turkey needs the West. It has major contracts now, defense industries, oil interest. You do not sacrifice that. But the best guarantee that an agreement will be implemented is that it's profitable on both sides. If you create situations where both the Turkish Cypriots and Turkey gain from the agreement, and you gain as well, why shouldn't they implement it? They gain a lot out of it. We save Turkey the cost of renting Varosha from us, which is a big cost. They have to pay for it at the end. Plus they get to end the isolation of Turkish Cypriots. which is again is a win-win arrangement. Why should someone not go for that type of arrangement, which is profitable on both sides and could give a very positive image on both sides? So there is an incentive, there is a guarantee mechanism, there is a pressure points. It's worth trying. And if they completely walk out of the agreement, they're going to face the consequences. So you have a point to argue that they are responsible.
If, with all the best goodwill in the world, that phase of negotiations under this new process doesn't quite pan out, and the two sides are left with their backstop measures activated, there could be an argument that says maybe they'll give up to trying again, because they've now got, Greek Cypriots have Varosha, Turkish Cypriots have an airport that's internationalized, and other forms of internationalization. What's the incentive? Because I think the argument against backstops is that if you give the trump cards away, neither side will want to continue to the finish line. So what's your view on that?
I mean, this will be an evolving mechanism that will monitor both sides. So at any point in the future, if one side does not enter negotiations, they might be losing from their legal entitlements in the backstops.
You can give and you can take away?
Yeah, that's the idea.
Right.
That's the idea. Precisely. So there is an inbuilt mechanism in this idea that the side that doesn't show goodwill in the comprehensive negotiations, and I'm insisting on that because the finality of resolving the Cyprus problem is essential to all of us. So a side that doesn't commit itself to a comprehensive settlement might lose part of their entitlements from this process. So one has to be very clear from the very beginning. You get the backstop, but you have to be committed to a comprehensive settlement.
Okay, and let's talk specifically about terminology. Is backstop another word for arbitration?
Backstop does not always entail arbitration, but you need an element of arbitration in order to implement the backstop, because otherwise there is a danger that the backstop itself will become the problem. So you delegate part of the problem to a foreign body who decides how the backstop will be implemented in order to avoid recreating the entire Cyprus problem into Varosha or to the airport in the north that you're willing to open up to international flights and international connections. And that was the argument I had problem with when I met with a Turkish diplomat 15 years ago. He said, I would like to have confidence building measures, but they will become confidence destroyer measures. And I didn't have an answer to that back then. But now, if we create some sort of foreign body who makes the final decisions, if we cannot, and if we can create a fairness, who is appointed there, if we have to create the mechanism, the sides that, we have a very clear mechanism, remember? The sides that implements its commitments and produces good ideas and commitments in the negotiations, gets their preferences prioritized. We can make a list of those. Once we do that, we don't have to worry about gaps, because those are going to be accommodated and addressed in a fair way.
Okay, so I get the impression that this is a form of facilitation with elements of arbitration in it.
Precisely.
Now, arbitration is what you would describe in modern parlance as a trigger word for many Greek Cypriots who, after 2004, political leadership said we never want to deal with arbitration again. How would you respond to that?
There is a lot of fear on that on the Greek Cypriot side. The first is that an unplanned was not an arbitration, because by definition arbitration it's final. You don't vote for it in a referendum. So once you accept the arbitration as a principle, whatever is decided, it's a final arrangement. You don't get to decide afterwards. So what the unplanned was an assisted mediation. We had elements of arbitration in the 1960s constitution as well. There was a foreign judge who could make some of these decisions. Again, there it didn't go very well. If one goes back to the history, they appointed a former Nazi professor to play that role. So it was a complete disaster. And even most people wouldn't know about it because it was such a sad and weird story of how he became the king in Cyprus. So we don't have a good experience with that, but the international experience is quite positive when it comes to these kind of arbitrations, because at the end of the day you end up having a solution. That's the beauty of it. It is a finality in the process, which is very appealing to both sides. You don't end up having small issues dragging forever and being always there to poison the atmosphere. It's very interesting also to look at the Greek experience on arbitration, because there we have a different set of dynamics. It's Greece that wants to have arbitration in the Aegean, and it's Turkey that objects to the arbitration. So why is it good in Greece and not good in Cyprus? Another question. We also had some kind of cases of arbitration in the issue with North Macedonia. There was a case in the courts before the agreement. Greece lost the case. High-profile case in the International Court in Hague, and that led the Greek government very quickly readjust its policy, and they went and got the peace agreement. So it's not surprising when you lose cases in the court for both Turkey and us to quickly readjust our policy and reach compromises. So often you have this mechanism, but the mechanism is default. But because you fear that you might lose the case, both us and Turkey and the Turkish Cypriots, you adjust your behavior accordingly and you show a much more moderate line. So the cases that you eventually take to an arbitration are very limited because you know that you don't want to lose a case.
Right. That could be argued as well on the Aegean. It's not so clear-cut exactly which way a case would go.
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, many people argue that it would be a very wise decision from Turkey to accept the Greek position. And likewise, it would be a very wise decision for us right now to accept what the Turkish Cypriots call about arbitration. Because if we think that we have good legal arguments and ethical arguments, it's likely that we're going to win. So if you're confident about your position and that you can argue it in front of someone who's fair and has a reputation of integrity and knowledge on the issue, then why not go for that? If you think that you have a good moral and ethical argument, then you trust processes that involve arbitration. You don't run away from them.
And the underlying principle is that the incentive is there to not lead to arbitration if possible.
Yeah. Most cases I have seen rely on the mechanism, but they don't take things into a final decision by court. They resolve them before it goes to the court. It's another way of knowing that I'm going to have a solution at the very end, but I'm building a process of communication with the other side, so we don't have to result and end the process in a legal way. We do it politically.
So it's incentive, not punishment. That's the philosophy behind this process.
So essentially you can have two formulas. One formula is that you can say that you reward the side that shows the best behavior in implementing its commitments and in the negotiations. That's one way. What about if both sides have good positions or they are more or less equal? Then if you have a decision to make, you can ask both sides to table a proposal.
Right.
And this is what happened in many occasions in other conflicts. Both sides come up with a comprehensive solution, which takes into consideration the other side's point of view. And then you choose the best, not a compromise. So you force the sides in advance to think of the concerns of the other side. So you have multiple methods there. What I'm trying to say is that you have so many interesting methods that force the sides to cooperate through this system. And by taking away those methods from the negotiating table in Cyprus, we kind of handicap the process.
Okay, and these are tried and tested methods that have been used in other conflicts in the world.
Yeah.
So there's process design, where you're negotiating and how you negotiate and how you move forward incrementally. And then there's implementation. One other big fear that I hear a lot is about how do we know what we ultimately agree to will be implemented. Mm-hmm. Again, it brings back the fear and issue of trust and fear.
That's absolutely legitimate. I had the same fear. I was very hesitant about Crans-Montana. And it was before I got a phone call from a very close Turkish colleague who was very upset with what's happening in Turkey. And they said to me, look at what's happening to us in Turkey with this government. How can we trust them, and how can you trust them when it comes? So it's a legitimate fear that Turkey will not implement or partly implement its arrangement. It's also a legitimate fear from us that if we keep the status quo, Turkey will keep punishing us. We're going to have problems in the buffer zone. We're going to have problems with Greece and Turkey, possibility of a conflict there. And of course, Turkey might be expanding its hold on the Greek Cypriot continental shelf and so on. So we cannot trust them either way. But the solution to that is the following. How about if we follow the same principle I described before, where Turkey gets some legal entitlements in Cyprus, and already Crans-Montana includes some legal entitlements for Turkey, but those are also tied to its implementation. And here we create an enforceable mechanism. We create a catch-22 for Turkey. Do I go for short-term gains by not implementing the agreement, but then risk losing legal entitlements in an arbitration or an implementation mechanism that I can hold for the next 200 years if I need to? And those can be migration related, it can be decision related, it could be also security related.
Right, we're talking sunset versus review clause, troops, guarantees.
Exactly. So the idea there is that Turkey might have some legal entitlements for the agreement, but those, like every other parties, we have to be tied and linked to implementing the agreement. If you don't implement the agreement, then you're losing those legal entitlements in a very explicit way, with a court, with someone who can decide, with a process. You can trigger it any time.
Okay, so these are you've discussed a lot of interesting ideas that could be brought to the process in Cyprus. We obviously got a new leadership in the Turkish Cypriot community, one that ran on a pro-federalist campaign. You collaborate with academics in the region and across the island. Is your view that any of these ideas are gaining ground?
There is a lot of discussion in various circles on some of these ideas. Most people would think that there is no other alternative to these ideas, partly because we have issues of trust on both sides that cannot be addressed in any other way. There's something very sad in international politics. We ended up losing trust to each other. So the Security Council is in a turmoil. The good era of peacemaking in the 1990s is gone. So we now have the liberal sort of peacemaking. International business adjusted very well in this because we cannot trust each other. They created arbitration law. And arbitration law boomed, exploded as one of the key industries in the world. When students come to Warwick to study politics, I say, okay, you do law as well and you do some kind of arbitration work in the future because there's so many jobs there. Unlike us, it has become a very good profession. In conflict resolution, we fail to learn from our lawyer colleagues. And we kept one of the most useful methods outside the arsenal of possible options that we can use. If you don't trust the other side, that's why you need to build those binding mechanisms. So there is a way out there that is getting the attention of policymakers. However, because of the reason that you have mentioned, the history of the Annan Plan, most people would not be open to use the word arbitration in the process. We need to do a little bit more discussion and educating the public, and the public having more public discourse to convince people that this is in their own interest.
Right, I've heard you describe it as a form of safeguard mechanisms.
Not having those mechanisms is like giving your 18-year-old child a car without an insurance. Would you risk that? That's why we buy insurance, because we want to avoid the worst case scenarios. This is exactly the same principle.
Okay, Professor, I'd like to end on a last question. You mentioned earlier the Women's Coalition in Northern Ireland, and a thought occurred to me this morning. Let's just set up a hypothetical, or a counterfactual. If there are two women leaders on both sides of the island, if we had two women leaders in each community, one in each community, based on your own experience and study of conflict, do you think there would be any different approach to the way that the problem is being tackled?
There's a lot of evidence on that, that the inclusion of women leads to more sustainable and quality agreements. I myself teach negotiations, and I do it in an interactive way where people given different scenarios. And when we run those trainings, we also use a software where people can self-report their performance. So I consistently see women outperforming men. So from the point of view of science, there's a lot of evidence that we collected, others have collected, that says having female negotiators is very beneficial to the side. There's also experiments that we have done with public opinion where we have seen that there is a preference to having mediators from the UN that are female. We have tested that recently in Bosnia. So our scholarly work has demonstrated what you have said. It's also a good public relations exercise, given what the UN is asking us to do. The UN has a resolution 3025 for the participation of women, and then we show up as Greek or Turkish Cypriot delegations with only men in the negotiating team. It's not a very nice way of interacting in those situations. We need to have mixed participations, and we also have the experience of academic and policy colleagues joining our international events, and we know in fact that we have very impressive women on both sides of the divide in Cyprus. That's why I talked before about the archaic system. How can we have those very impressive personalities on both sides of the divide in Cyprus, who represent us in international fora with incredible talent, but they're not included in the actual negotiations. This is very sad.
Takes us back to that issue of inclusivity as a key fundamental principle in negotiations.
And inclusivity is not an empty word. Inclusivity needs to be practiced and needs to be enforced in the way we think about the Cyprus question.
Professor, thanks very much for your time. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.